A pleasant good day to all, and welcome to the SNF recording of the chapter relating to the heart. And in terms of what will be expected as it relates to the flow of work, the first thing we'll be looking at comparing and contrasting the pulmonary versus the systemic circulation. This is something that is very important. Pulmonary circulation relating to the lungs, systemic relating to the entire body. Then we'll map the structure and function of the heart, anatomy and physiology of the heart. It is always important to understand these two things because they are interrelated. Next, we look at the function of the heart, describe the location, layers associated with the heart, and most importantly, trace the pathway of blood as it flows through the heart. Then we'll move on to circulation, speak to the events of the cardiac cycle, explain the electrical conducting system of the heart, explain and examine an ECG, define cardiac output, speak to the autonomic nervous system and Frank-Starling's law, and then to wrap it all up, we'll be talking about listing and defining terms which describe certain variations in heart rate, as well as looking at examples of factors that may cause variations in the heart rate. Okay, so in terms of the circulation on the heart, circulation, how does it occur within the human body? Well, it's a continuous one-way circuit, and it is, of course, this propulsion of the blood is facilitated through the actions of the heart. The heart itself is located between the lungs, left of the midline, in an area known as the mediastinum. The apex is always pointed towards the left, and this is very important because sometimes when you get diagrams and you see a heart indicated on that diagram, you can always tell anatomically which side is the left side and which is the right side by always looking to see the apex of the heart. What direction is it pointing towards? It always points towards the left side. So that is something that is very important. And here we see a diagram illustrating that which was just said. The lungs, right and left. Notice the heart, this region here, the apex, pointing towards the left. So if we were to draw a midline, we know that over here it's the left and over here is the right. Of course, in section we do have the ribs that are shown here and the pericardium. We'll speak a little bit more to that later on, but this is very important in providing a shield to the heart to ensure that it doesn't rub against the lung. Diaphragm, very important muscle, the main muscle, and you'd look associated with respiration. So we'd look more into this when we look at the chapter on respiration. So let's talk about the structure of the heart and its tissue layers. There are three major layers: endo, which is the interior, myocardium, the thickest layer, and the epicardium, which is the thin outermost layer. So very importantly, the endocardium, this is the layer that is intimate with the blood in terms of actually touching it, whereas the epicardium refers to the outer layer of the heart. Let's see how that relates structurally when we look at this image here, which is showing the section through the heart itself. So once again, the endocardium, so this is intimate with the blood in terms of the blood flowing through the heart. It will actually touch this layer, the myocardium, or the muscular layer or muscle layer. And here we have the epicardium, as shown here, visceral. This is the outermost layer. Now surrounding the heart is the sac known as the pericardium. And as previously mentioned, this pericardium is very important in that it prevents friction from occurring it acts as a buffer zone, as it will, preventing friction between the heart and the organ that is immediately behind it, the lungs. Let's move on. So, which layer of the heart is the muscle? Muscle begins with the letter M. Myocardium begins with the letter M. So that's a nice way of looking at it and also a nice way to remember it. Myocardium and muscle, they both begin with the letter M. So Let's now look at some of the special features of the myocardium. Now, the muscle associated with the myocardium is a very specialized class of muscle known as cardiac muscles. These muscles are striated, they have a single nucleus, they are controlled involuntarily. So in other words, we don't have control over our heart, which would become problematic should we go to sleep. So that is why in terms of the autonomic nervous system, it does have control over the cardiac muscle, such that when we do go to sleep, most critically, the heart continues beating. Cardiac muscle also has intercalated discs. These intercalated discs, they are associated with carrying the electrical impulse towards all the tissues of the heart, ensuring that a heartbeat occurs in a rhythmic fashion. And then we also have branching in terms of the cardiac muscles. They also have branching muscle fibers associated with it. So here it is, we are looking at a stained section of cardiac tissue. And what we would notice here, the nucleus, and most critically right here, we see these structures, and these are the intercalated discs. Very importantly, and they're shown here, a little darker staining than what occurs on the normal cardiac tissue. Okay, now let's look at the heart. In terms of the heart, it is usually called a double pump because the right side is associated with the pulmonary circuit, or the movement of blood to and from the lungs, whereas the left side is associated with the systemic circuit, and that refers to the movement of blood throughout the entire body. Let's move forward. So the chambers associated with the heart are the atria and the ventricles. The atria, coming from the word atrium, and this means receiving the blood. The atrium, plural atria, they receive the blood as it comes into the heart. The ventricles, these are the lower chambers. They pump the blood from the right atria to the lungs in terms of getting it oxygenated, and additionally, it pumps the oxygenated blood throughout the body. And that is very important in the systemic circulation. This image here, it shows the heart as a double pump, and that's showing the circulation of the blood. So from the left side, this blood goes, as is shown here, from the left ventricle, it goes to through the atrium. It comes the other way around. Just checking to see if you all were paying attention. From the right atrium, so the blood is returned to the right side of the heart. So here we have deoxygenated blood coming in to the right atria, going down to the right ventricle, and then from there it goes to the left and right lung respectively. So at this region here, you have a split, something known as a bifurcation, and blood goes to both the left and right lung. After oxygenation occurs, it is returned to the right atria. It returns to the left atria, then it goes to the left ventricle, and then it enters the systemic circulation via the exit through the main artery of the heart, the aorta. So that's very important. This is just showing greater detail of the heart. Let's see if we could look and see what's happening. Right atrium, this is where blood is received from the body itself. So it comes via the inferior and superior vena cavas, or vena cavas, as some people like to say. So the blood is returned the superior, and why do they call them superior and inferior? The inferior vena cava or vena cava returns blood from the lower portions of the body. So regions below the level of the heart, blood is returned via the inferior vena cava, whereas regions superior or above the level of the heart, they return blood via the superior vena cava. So this blood enters the right atrium. From here, it goes through the right AV valve, so-called because this valve lies between the atria and ventricle, and the other name for this valve is also the tricuspid valve. So the blood then enters the right ventricle, and from here it's now going on its path towards the lungs, very importantly in terms of receiving oxygen such that when it does return via the right pulmonary veins to the um, right via the right pulmonary vein as shown here, it returns to via the right and left pulmonary veins, returning to the left side of the heart, and here it enters the atria, and then it goes to the ventricle to be forcibly removed from the heart when contraction occurs, and then of course this removal is facilitated via the aorta. Very important. So once again, blood enters the right atria, goes to the right ventricle. Via the pulmonary trunk, it goes to the right and left. Via the left and right pulmonary artery, it goes to the left lung and right lung respectively. Then it is returned to the heart via the pulmonary veins, right and left pulmonary veins. It is returned to the left atria. When it returns to the left atria, it goes down to the left ventricle, and then of course contraction causes the ejection of the blood through the aorta. And that in a nutshell speaks to how blood circulates through the heart. Let's look at a question related to this. Which chamber of the heart receives oxygenated blood coming in from the lungs and the pulmonary veins? So write the recipient. So which chamber? Well, it'll have to be one of the atria, the right or the left. So we have to decide which one. Well, the right receives blood deoxygenated. So therefore, the correct answer will be the left atrium. That is the one that receives the oxygenated blood coming from the lungs. These valves, I mentioned them as we were going through. The right and left AV valves, known respectively as the tri and bicuspid, because of the number of flaps associated with them. And of course, we have the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. These, of course, are found in their respective structures, most critically in terms of the aorta, very important to prevent the backflow of blood from the aorta getting back into the lungs. So this is just showing these valves that we just mentioned. Okay, so this is tracing the pathway of blood through the heart. I just mentioned it, so we'll just diagrammatically follow the pathway. So first, of course, the blood enters here, which is the right atria, goes through to the right ventricle, then it goes to the left and right pulmonary artery, goes to the lungs, gets oxygenated, is returned via the right and left pulmonary veins, and now it enters the left atrium of the heart, goes down via the left AV valve, it goes into the left ventricle, and of course then from the left ventricle it goes via the aorta to the entire body through the systemic circuit. So of course, what is the purpose of the valves? As we mentioned, preventing backflow of blood. Now, the heart of itself pumps blood throughout the entire body. But most importantly, we have to remember that the muscle itself, it needs nutrients, it needs oxygen that is provided from the blood itself. So how is it that the myocardium, or if you would like to say the meaty part of the heart, how does it receive its nutrients? And it does so via the coronary arteries. So very importantly, there's a coronary circulation, right and left coronary arteries, that brings blood to the heart muscle itself. And that is very important. As seen here, if you were to look on the structure showing the heart, here's the right coronary artery. And if we were to look here, we see the left coronary artery. And then, of course, you have the cardiac veins. So coronary artery, cardiac veins. Coronary artery brings oxygenated blood. The cardiac veins takes deoxygenated blood away from the heart. And it's very important to note that whenever we do look at diagrams of the heart, we'll see this blue and red coloration. This is just done to enable us to differentiate between oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So the question which arises, do we have blue blood within our bodies? And the answer is absolutely not. This is just done on the diagram to represent deoxygenated blood, but when you look at within our bodies itself, blood is never blue. All right, so this is just showing the opening and closing of the valves, very importantly to prevent backflow. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So the heart itself. So the left and right side of the heart, they work together in a cardiac cycle. The systole, which is the contraction phase, and the diastole, which is the resting phase. Let's have a look. So the diastole, what happens here? The atria fill with blood and begins to flow into the ventricles, and as soon as their walls relax, we have atrial systole contraction. And then, of course, after the contraction, you have a rest period once more, the ventricular systole. Cardiac output. Now, this is the one formula you'd have to look at in terms of cardiac output. So do note that in terms from a definition perspective, cardiac output is simply the heart rate multiplied by the stroke volume. So should you ever do get questions relating to this, do note that the application of this formula will give you the correct answer. Okay, we look at the structure of the heart, we look at its location, we looked at how the blood flows through it. Now let's talk about the electrical conduction system. Now electrical energy stimulates heart muscle, right, via the SA node, which is known as the pacemaker. Now it's important that the heart receives electrical stimulation such that all the cells contract, and they contract at the same time. Now, the rationale behind the contraction at the same time, this ensures that the heart is able to function effectively as a pump when all the cells contract. So now it could eject the blood out, either forcing it through the aorta, sending it through the the systemic circulation. And it's very important that they all contract at the same time. If they do not contract at the same time, what would happen? The heart would begin to quiver. And this quivering is referred to, it looks like very much like jelly on a plate. It just shakes and jiggles, but there's no contraction occurring. So very importantly, that this situation does not arise. And to ensure that that does not arise, we have this pacemaker. You can think of the pacemaker as a drum beater. Imagine you're taking a march. If you could remember your days back in school when it's sports day and whichever team or house you were in and you're marching, right? You're going left, right, doom, 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 left, right, doom, doom. And that pace is being set either by the drum back in the day, or if it was music was being played, you're hearing that beat. So you know when to put down left, right, left, right. Very important that you get that beat. So similarly with the heart, in terms of setting that beat, sending those electrical signals to all of the cells, cardiac cells, such that they contract at the same time, that is achieved via the SA node. We also have the AV node, which is a backup to the SA node, and that also will facilitate sending of electrical impulses should there be some failure with the SA node. In terms of the distribution of that electrical signal, you do have specialized fibers that distribute it, and they are known as the atrioventricular bundle or the bundle of His, and also Purkinje fibers. These are known as conduction myofibers. And most critically, getting them to the individual cells, this is the job of the intercalated discs. Let's have a look at this in a different format. So here it is, we are looking at a diagram of the heart. This is the pacemaker, the SA node. So it goes from the SA node to the AV node, it goes through there. From the AV node, it goes to the bundle of His. From the bundle of His, it then goes along via these Purkinje fibers, and it then reaches the individualized cells through the actions of the actions associated with the passage of these of the electrical impulse via the intercalated discs, as we mentioned before. Okay, so how, in terms of the control of the heart rate, earlier in this lecture, we mentioned the role of the autonomic nervous system or the automatic nervous system. And that is very important in terms of controlling the heart rate. And the main reason which we said behind that is such that we can go to bed knowing that the heart continues to beat because its control is not under the voluntary nervous system, but rather the involuntary or autonomic nervous system. And that is very important. This just speaks to the control of the heart rate, as we did mention, right? Both the sympathetic and parasympathetic, they have to work together to maintain this balance. All right, so this is just showing the parasympathetic via the vagus nerve, and sympathetic nerve is showing the way that they are set up in terms of assisting to ensure that the electrical impulses continue to go from the SA node. But not only do they ensure that they go from the SA node, but also ensures that variations of the impulses could occur via stimulation from the parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves. All right. So let's now speak very importantly to the variations in heart rate. So there's some we'd like to speak to and two we'd like to focus on, the bradycardia and the tachycardia. Right, so tachycardia refers to the speeding up of the heart rate, whereas the bradycardia refers to the slowing down of the heart rate. What is the medical term for a heart rate of more than 100 beats per minute? Well, that sounds a little fast, and that is why it is known as the tachycardia. All right, so Frank-Starling law of the heart. Now this law, Frank-Starling, represents the relationship between stroke volume and the end diastolic volume. Very simply, this law states that the stroke volume of the heart increases in response to an increase in the volume of blood. So in other words, the heart has the ability to handle the increased volume of blood coming through it, and it does so by increasing its stroke volume. All right, now what we're looking at here, we're looking at the electrical activity associated with the heart itself, and this is known as an ECG tracing. Now the ECG tracing, there are specific points on the ECG trace known as the P, Q, R, S, and T points. And by extension, this is known as a PQRST wave. Now, for those of us who are so educated, as it were, in this area, now there are numerous books written on this topic, you could tell differences or if there are issues with various parts of the heart when you compare a normal trace with that of an abnormal trace. So in other words, which is very importantly, by just looking at this trace, one who is so skilled in the area could tell if there are abnormalities in the chambers, in the muscles associated with the heart, or with the electrical activity associated with it. So that's very important in terms of the PQRST trace, which is also known as the ECG trace. Okay, so in terms of the presentation, we looked at the heart. First, we looked at the structure of the heart. We looked at its location, located in the mediastinum, left of the midline, with the apex pointing towards the left. Then we look at the circulation of blood through the heart. Of course, the blood is flowing into the right atria, right ventricle. Then it goes to the lungs, returns from the lungs to the left atria, left ventricle, and of course leaves via the the aorta. It leaves the entire body to enter the systemic circulation. We also looked at the electrical activity associated with the heart. Very importantly, that the pacemaker, the SA node, very critical for maintaining that rhythm of the heart. That rhythm, dum dum dum, dum dum dum, da dum da dum, dum dum. It gives the beat, sending those electrical impulses that goes via the the network, distribution network, to every cell in the heart. And that is very important to ensure proper contraction of the heart at all times. Then, of course, we mentioned the Frank-Starling law in terms of, yes, the heart has the ability to handle increased volumes by actually contracting and moving this blood volume out when it is presented with it. Okay? All right, so that concludes the presentation. I hope you did enjoy it, and all the best. Take care. Bye for now.